Well, hello, my kindred spirits. How are y'all doing today? I hope that everybody's doing great, and I'm so happy to see you. Today, I've got something really special for you. I'm going to read a couple of stories to you from an old book that was mine when I was a little girl. But I'm going to share a couple of things with you first before we get into this delicious little storybook. Now, I was very fortunate when I was a child in that my father helped develop a love of reading with me and my brother when we were small. And he would take us to the library every Saturday morning, and we could pick out as many books as the library would allow us to pick out. And then we'd take them home and we would just pour through them all week long. And you have to remember, this was, I guess he started taking me to the library when I was about 5, so that was 1978. And our playtime was always outdoors. There wasn't a lot of television watching. There was some Saturday morning television, and then, on occasion we would watch TV, but mostly we were outside. And if we weren't outside, we were in our rooms or just maybe reading a book, but we were using our imaginations like crazy. And I think a lot of us who grew up during that time did that. And I also think, though, that having good books to read helped to really develop our imaginations. And so I tried to do that with my children too when they were growing up. I tried to limit that television and send them outside to play. And we took them to the library and let them get as many books as possible so that their imaginations could become rich as well with those stories. And then they could go outside and think about those things as they went about their days. It's a great way to live. And so I get a little excited about things like this, forgive me, but I wanted to share that with you because it was such an important part of my childhood, and then as an adult I love to read as well. So this old book is called the Burgess Flower book for children, and it was written by Thornton W Burgess. And his stories, I believe his first stories were copyrighted in 1923, maybe before, but the first bunch were from 1923, so they're old. But I love his stories because he tried to educate children about the natural world, about plants and animals and the ocean and natural habitats of animals. He tried to educate children about those things with stories, because after all, children love to hear a story, a funny story about one of the characters, Reddy Fox. If you hear about a fox's habitat through the eyes of told by Reddy Fox, it's more intriguing, I think, to a little kid. And so I just loved these. And so it today is January the 28th, and so here in the Southeast, where I've always lived, springtime starts to peak about this time. She kind of peeks her head out and then goes back in, peeks it out and goes back in. But she starts to peek her pretty little head, and it is starting to happen outside right now. I'm looking out and the sun is shining, and I'm hearing birds singing out there right now. And it's always been so fun to me because my birthday is next week, and every year the daffodils start blooming during my birthday. And it's always just been magical to me to see those blooming around my birthday. And when I was little, I would go find leaves and flowers and anything that I could to press into books. And what I love this book, and for so many reasons, but one of the reasons is because I still have a little pressed daffodil in here from when I was probably 6 years old when I went and picked that daffodil, and I know I picked it with my grandmother. But this book, all these years later, still smells like an old book and a sweet daffodil. So isn't that something? It's magical to me. It is absolutely magical. And so I hope that some of that magic it gets infused to you too after I read this story to you, and you can kind of go to bed and go to sleep thinking on these stories. And I hope that you go find some of them if you can. They still print a lot of these books. Again, look up Thornton W Burgess, and they still print some of his books. If you can't find them in a new publication, you can find a lot of them at old library discard sales. And this one actually came from the Benton County Library, which is in West Tennessee. And I know my father picked it up for me at a discounted library sale again many years ago. I think I was about 5 when he gave it to me. But I thought it'd be fun tonight to read a story or two out of this book for you. So in the first of the book here, it says, "To the awakening in children of love for our wildflowers and their desire to preserve them in their native habitats, for the beauty and joy they give to the world, this book is dedicated." And then this says copyright 1923 by Thornton W Burgess. And I'm going to read to you the preface from the book here. It says, "This book is offered as a companion volume to the Burgess Bird Book for Children and the Burgess Animal Book for Children. It is intended solely as an introduction for the youngest readers to the fascinating flower world. It makes no pretense to being a botany or even a general handbook on flowers. Its purpose is to awaken and stimulate an interest in our wildflowers, which may lead to a desire to know more about them and to seek such information in the many excellent books now available. Because of the story method of treatment, and also because of the limited vocabulary of the little child, the use of scientific names and even the names of most of the parts of the plants and flowers, save in the appendix for older people, has been avoided. This necessarily prevents that accuracy of description which the adult may desire. The vast number of flowers, which is America's rich heritage, makes it impossible to describe within the confines of a volume of this size more than a limited number. No small part of the task was the selection of the flowers to be included. Most of them were chosen because of their wide distribution. For the most part, only the commoner flowers, those most likely to be encountered in walks in field, meadow, and woodland, have been chosen. A few of the rarer ones have been included because of their beauty and the hope that the desire to find these may act as a stimulant to interest. Peter Rabbit lives very close to the flowers. Peter is the beloved friend of children. Therefore, Peter has been chosen as the guide for the little folk. If what Peter has discovered is not clearly told in the text, I hope that the illustrations will enable the readers to make sure of identification. For the excellent photographs from which these illustrations were made, I am indebted to," and it lists a whole bunch of names, but I'm not going to read all of these names. But then it goes on to say that for the hearty cooperation and goodwill of these, I acknowledge my indebtedness and appreciation. In the use of scientific names and in family names, Gray's manual has been followed throughout. Names in parentheses are preferred and in common by many botanists. It is my earnest hope that at least some children will be led to that interest in our wildflowers, which must develop into a love for them, and that through this love will be aroused to desire to protect them. Many species are in serious danger of becoming extinct because of the ruthless picking of the blossoms and tearing up of the roots by the thoughtless. And it's signed the author. Okay. And again, I'm not sure if it was if it was this book, if it was my grandmother, if it was my father, exactly what it was that developed my love for flowers. I'm sure it was a combination. We all have little glitches, little glimpses, little pieces of people that we came from that turn us into who we are. And so I like to think that my grandmother and my father had a huge hand in that, because I love flowers and I always have. And I think it's due in part to this little book and to my grandmother, who was always telling me about the flowers. She knew every flower, every tree, everything that grew. She knew the name of it. So let's go on to the first chapter. This is chapter 1, and it says, Peter Rabbit finds signs of spring. When some bluebirds on the way, he is due here any day. Old Mother West Wind's children, the merry little breezes, sang this softly as they danced over the green meadows and around the old briar patch. Peter Rabbit pricked up his long ears. How do you know? Who told you so? He demanded. Nobody told us so. We just feel it, Peter, cried the merry little breezes, and kept on singing as they danced. Huh, exclaimed Peter. Feeling isn't knowing. Perhaps Winsome is on his way, and perhaps he isn't. I hope he is, for that would mean that Mistress Spring is on her way too, and she can't get here too soon to suit me. But I would feel a lot more sure of it if I could see some signs. Use your eyes, Peter, use your eyes. There are flowers in bloom already, for we've seen them. What better sign that Mistress Spring is coming do you want? Chanted the merry little breezes. Peter jumped a foot off the ground. Say, are you crazy? He cried. Look at all this snow all over the green meadows. Do you expect me to believe any such story as that? We don't care whether you believe it or not. It is so, cried the merry little breezes, dancing around Peter and throwing snow in his face. Welcome robins on the wing, very soon you'll hear him sing. With this, the merry little breezes danced away across the green meadows towards the green forest, leaving Peter to stare after them, as if quite sure they were really as crazy as they seemed. Of course it isn't true, muttered Peter. The very idea of saying that they have seen flowers in bloom when the ground is still frozen and there is snow everywhere. I don't believe a word of it. Nevertheless, Peter couldn't get it out of his mind that the merry little breezes had seen something that he hadn't. Thoughts of the glad springtime began to chase each other through his funny little head. Presently, he began to have a queer feeling, which little by little he recognized as the very feeling that the merry little breezes had spoken of, the feeling that Mistress Spring really and truly was on her way. And remember, the language is very different. This was written in 1923, so some words don't mean what they mean today. Huh, exclaimed Peter, just as before, and shook himself, but he couldn't shake off that feeling. Then he thought again of what the merry little breezes had said about signs and about using his eyes. Huh, he said, I guess if there's anything to see, I would see it. There's nothing the matter with my eyes, and I haven't seen any signs of spring yet. Flowers in bloom, the very idea. Now, of course, Peter didn't really believe that the merry little breezes had told an untruth. No, indeed. He thought that they were either just trying to tease him or that they had been mistaken. But he couldn't get rid of the thought that perhaps he had seen something which they had seen something which he hadn't, and nothing upsets Peter more than the thought of others knowing more than he does about what's going on in the green forest and on the green meadows. If there are any signs of spring which they have seen, I'd like to know where they are, muttered Peter, as he hopped all through the old dear briar patch, looking sharply at all the bushes and the little trees and brambles to see if any of the little sleeping buds showed any signs of waking. But they didn't, and Peter felt satisfied that there were no signs of spring in the old briar patch. Certainly there were none on the green meadows, for those were still covered with snow. Then Peter made up his mind to visit the green forest, just to make sure that he had missed nothing there. Nowhere could he see the least sign of the coming of Mistress Spring. Snow was everywhere. An idea popped into his head. If they saw any flowers, it must be that they saw them through the window of Farmer Brown's house. I've seen them there myself, thought he, but flowers up there are no sign of spring. A few minutes later, Peter came to that part of the green forest where in places it was swampy. You know, a swampy place is where the ground is always very wet. This was the warmest place in all of the green forest. The snow had disappeared in spots, and one of these, a tiny stream of water, was coming from a place where it bubbled out of the ground. It was a spring, and the tiny stream was at the beginning of the Laughing Brook. Peter stopped on the edge of it. Just then along came the Merry Little Breezes, and one of them tickled his nose with a queer smell. It smells to me as if Jimmy Skunk had left a little of that scent of his around here, but I haven't seen Jimmy's tracks anywhere, thought Peter. Again he sniffed. This time it seemed as if that smell came right out of the water in front of him. He stared at it a minute, and for the first time noticed several queer brown and green things like pointed hooks standing in the water. Peter looked forward to look at one a little closer, and right then he made a discovery. That smell, like Jimmy Skunk's perfume, came from that queer little hood. Queer means odd. Peter hopped a step nearer that he might see better. On one side of that queer hood was an opening, a narrow opening. He was all curiosity now. He held his nose while he peeped in that narrow opening. You see, he didn't like that smell, and it was so close to the little hood that it was very strong. At first he saw nothing, but a moment later he discovered down at the bottom of that little hood a sort of thick stem all covered with something yellow. Peter's eyes seemed to pop out of his head as he looked harder than ever. Then he saw that that very thick stem was covered with very, very tiny flowers, all yellow, with the dust like gold which most flowers have, which is called pollen. Peter jumped a foot straight in the air. "Why, the Merry Little Breezes did tell the truth," he exclaimed. "Of course we did," cried the Merry Little Breezes, who had been watching him. "We always tell the truth. These are the first flowers of the year, the flowers of the skunk cabbage, and the sure sign that Mistress Spring is on her way." Peter remembered the big broad leaves he had seen so often growing here and in other swampy places in the summer. He looked all about, but he didn't even see one. He wrinkled his brow in a puzzled way. "I thought the skunk cabbage was a big green plant," said he. "So it is," laughed one of the Merry Little Breezes. "These are its flowers. They bloom before the leaves show at all. Queer, isn't it?" "I should say so," replied Peter. "I didn't know it had any flowers. I've seen these things early in the spring many times, but I didn't know what they were. I never thought anything about them." "That comes of not using your eyes, Peter," cried the Merry Little Breezes. "There are many wonderful things all about you every day which you never see at all." What is there wonderful about these?" demanded Peter a little sharply, for he felt a little put out that anyone should think he didn't see all there was to be seen. "Isn't it wonderful that all these little flowers came up and be brave enough and strong enough to bloom when Jack Frost is still making everybody shiver?" "Ooh," asked the Merry Little Breezes. Peter nodded. "That's so," he said slowly. "I didn't think of that. It is wonderful. I don't see how they do it." He looked at the tiny flowers with new interest. He saw how thick was the little brown and green hood inside of which they were blooming, and how warm and cozy it was in there, with only a narrow opening for the light to enter. Then he began to understand how Old Mother Nature was protecting them. "It is wonderful," he repeated. "I certainly have learned something today. I've always watched for the coming of Winsome Bird as the first sure sign of sweet Mistress Spring, and never once have thought that there might be other new signs. Do you know, I rather like this smell now. It's sort of a promise that winter will soon be over. Now, I must hurry to tell Mrs. Peter the splendid news that the first flowers of spring this year are in bloom." And let me show you a picture real quick, because this is a picture of the skunk cabbage right here, and that's what Peter was smelling. I've never seen one of those before, but where we live, there is a beautiful piece of land, and there's a little creek that runs through it called Pumpkin Creek. And so when my children were small, I would read this book to them, and we would go down to Pumpkin Creek, and we would look for those little things, like little bitty flowers coming up, little bluets or little violets coming up, and we could see that spring running. And it's a beautiful space down there. My kids called it fairyland because it was a bright, vibrant chartreuse green. And when you walk down there, there wasn't much water in Pumpkin Creek, but it was just a little bit flowing through the rocks, just enough to hear it kind of bubbling through. And so you understand when you hear that sound, if you're really quiet, it sounds like a laughing brook because of the sound that it makes. And it was just magical. It was just magical to go down there and to think about maybe some of the people who lived on this land before us, and maybe how they went down there and put their feet in that little Pumpkin Creek, and some of the things that they may have found floating, some of the salamanders or the tadpoles or some of the frogs that were down there, because you can hear the frogs really good down there. And it is, I haven't been down there in so long, and it makes me want to go down there today. But it would be such a beautiful place to take y'all to sometime, because it is peaceful and beautiful and quiet, and it just gives you a lot of time to just sit and think. And if you go down there, it's like I said, it's a magical little place. So now that I'm talking about it, I want to go back down there again. So that was the first story out of this thick book. Can you imagine a little bitty girl in the 70s, the late 70s, early 80s, reading this whole thing? I did. I loved it. And I learned so much about flowers as I grew up from this little book. And yeah, if you can find a copy of it somewhere, I would encourage you to get this for yourself or for your little ones if you have children, because if you can start reading to them when they're really, really young, they'll develop an interest in the natural world. So I hope that you enjoyed that, my friends, and I appreciate you watching, and I can't wait to see you on the next video. Bye-bye.